To say I know my brother would be like saying I know the back of my hand, though I'm sure that can't be said for a lot of siblings out there. As children, we were pretty much inseparable. We would go everywhere and do almost everything together. We can attribute most of our closeness to our parents, though, who seemed to like the novelty of having twins. While our father wasn't really involved all that much, our mother would have a field day with us. She would dress us up in matching outfits and parade us around like we were some sideshow spectacle. She'd cart us around and show us off to all her friends, like she had turned water into wine or something. Some of you might think that being forced into such a situation would have driven us further apart, wanting any chance we could find to get away from one another. On the contrary, however, her overbearingness towards us only seemed to strengthen our bond. We both took solace in the fact that we shared this embarrassment together. Don't get me wrong, we both rebelled against our parents with a vengeance. We got into more mischief than I care to remember. Thinking back on half the things we did, I'm surprised we are both still alive, honestly. During middle school, we were still as close as ever. We sort of became those stereotypical characters you'd see in cartoons. The twins who always seem to be up to something. The brothers or sisters who often use their twinliness for nefarious purposes. That was us. We'd play pranks on anyone who was unlucky enough to cross our paths. Teachers, classmates. Hell, we even pranked each other if we were bored enough. We were never malicious in our antics, though, and we pranked ourselves more than we pranked others in public. I suppose this made us more endearing towards the student body than just a couple of pricks. While we are similar in many ways, my brother and I did have our differences, though that's to be expected as we weren't exact carbon copies of one another, even though most people still saw us that way. If I had to describe Sean, I would have to say he was bright. His personality was far brighter than mine. He was the type of guy who would illuminate a room as soon as he stepped through the door. He was always warm and inviting to others, regardless of who it was. I, on the other hand, was a bit more closed off. I wasn't a recluse by any means, but I mostly kept to myself whenever Sean wasn't around. Sean was also much more charismatic than I was. He was able to control a crowd with his words in a way I had never seen before. People would often joke that he was going to be the next president. I realized that I'm making it sound like he was the greatest part of our family, but Sean wouldn't think that for a moment. He was always complimenting me on the things I would come up with. That's what I did for most of the time through our adolescence. I would think up these elaborate pranks and tricks and tell them to Sean, and without batting an eye, he'd say, "Let's do it." We were quite the pair. The charismatic frontrunner and the clever introvert. During our senior year of high school, our relationship began to change. We were slowly beginning to drift further and further apart. Sean was becoming more obsessed with girls and life after high school, while I was more focused on my hobbies. While we did inevitably drift apart, whenever we would see each other, it would be like nothing had changed. We would instantly snap back to how things used to be. Over the years, our relationship became more and more distant. We had both gotten vastly different jobs and moved out of our parents' house. Coincidentally, though, we both ended up finding houses in the same town a few counties over, but our houses ended up on complete opposite sides of the town. Every other month or so, Sean and I would still try to get together and hang out. We'd play video games, drink beer, and just chat about life. Those little hangout sessions were very therapeutic, at least for me anyway. Work had been consuming me, so to be able to vent and relax with someone who gets me was nice. Eventually, those hangout sessions faded too, however. Sean was slowly getting consumed by work as well, though he told me he was striving for a promotion that he felt he'd never win. Then, one day, Sean suddenly stopped speaking to me altogether. It was odd. Despite our inability to see one another regularly, we still liked to keep in touch through texting. I had sent him quite a few messages over the course of a couple of days, and when he didn't respond, I thought it was strange. I didn't want to pry though, as everyone needs their space when they're dealing with stuff, so I just let it go. Then, after nearly a week of silence from my brother, my mom had messaged me on Facebook asking if I had heard from him recently. I told her I hadn't, but that work had been stressing him out lately. While I wasn't concerned, my mother was on the edge of her seat, and I could tell that just by how she worded her messages. Even though we both moved out, that hadn't ceased her overbearingness. She asked me if I would go over to his house and check up on him to make sure he was alright. After much back and forth, I agreed, and headed over there. I drove the 30 minutes to the other side of town after I had gotten home from work. I pulled into his driveway and marched right up to the door. After a few raps of my knuckles, I waited for him to answer. A minute passed, then 2, and right when I was about to knock again, the door opened. Sean was standing there before me, with a huge grin on his face, like the grin someone makes when they're faking happiness for a picture. I greeted him and immediately held out a fist in front of me. We always fist bumped whenever we'd see each other. A bit childish, I know, but it was a habit. I waited as my hand hovered a few inches away. Sean then reached out as if he were going to shake my hand. I just stared at his open grip before dropping my fist. This was the first time in my life that seeing my brother was awkward. I'm no stranger to awkwardness, but when it came to my brother, that didn't exist. I shook off the feeling and asked him how he was doing. His responses were strange as well. He only responded in short, single sentences, like he was trying to write a book with his mouth. As someone who has seen Sean speak to an entire room filled with people and flow effortlessly with his words, this was jarring to hear. He said everything was fine, that he had just been exhausted from work. He apologized for not responding to any of our messages. He said that he had lost his phone somewhere at work. Another strange thing for Sean to say. My brother's phone was always permanently glued to his person. I couldn't seem to wrap my head around what was happening. On one hand, he was clearly standing in front of me, and I could see him with my own 2 eyes. And on the other, he seemed like a complete stranger to me. I asked him once again if he was sure that he was fine. That same cheesy grin never left his face, and he told me not to worry. I nodded to him, wished him well, and thought about bringing my hand up for another fist bump, but decided against it. I headed back to my car and drove off. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was severely wrong with him. If it were anyone else, I would have just dropped it and minded my own business. But I couldn't with Sean. Halfway home, I spun the car around and drove back to his house. I parked a few houses away so I could see if he did anything strange. It wasn't long before the sun started to set, and just before sundown occurred, I watched as Sean stepped out of the house. He walked over, got into his car, and drove off. As he rounded the corner of the block, I pulled into his driveway. I walked up to his house, pulled out the spare key Sean had given to me when he moved in, and I entered. I walked around the house looking for any clue as to what could be wrong with him. I know this wasn't something a normal person should be doing, but I was at a loss. He clearly wasn't himself. After coming up empty-handed, I sighed and decided to just head home. Just as I was about to exit the front door, I heard something. A dull thud. Then another. Wondering what they could be, I stepped back inside. The thuds grew louder and louder. When they became the loudest, I realized that they were coming from underneath my feet. I ran out of the back door and found what I was looking for. The entrance to his wine cellar. It was locked, but luckily there was a pretty sturdy shovel nearby. I pried the lock off and descended the steps. When I reached the bottom, I found the pull cord to the only light in the cellar. I pulled it, and I couldn't believe my eyes. It was Sean. He was sitting there tied to a pipe, and his mouth had been sewn shut. He was covered in blood and bruises. In a panic, I lunged towards him to help, but he recoiled with tears in his eyes. It was then that I realized that he thought I was the one who did this to him. I calmly explained who I was and that I was here to help him. His fear turned to happiness in his eyes. I quickly freed him from his bindings and pulled him outside. Once there, I called the police. It only took a few minutes for the house to be filled with officers. A few hours later, at the hospital, after the doctors removed the stitches from my brother's mouth, some police officers arrived to follow up and ask some questions. My brother explained that the last thing he remembers was answering the door for a delivery he had been expecting. He said that the delivery driver had been acting strange and refused to release his package, but after that it was all a blur until he woke up in his cellar. After the police finished their questioning and left, Sean looked concerned before turning to me. He told me he left out a key bit of information that he didn't tell the police. He said that after he woke up in the cellar, that man came down a few times and just stared at him. Every time the man would return to the cellar, his appearance had changed to look more and more like Sean. He said he didn't want to reveal this information for fear the police wouldn't believe him, and also that I might be implicated in the crime for my appearance. A few days later, one of the officers got in contact with us and told us that they had found my brother's car. It was abandoned on the edge of town. They also said they found something else. Something that looked like bits of skin and hair outside the driver's side door, heading off into the woods nearby.